Why, hey there, everyone. GleeCon here again. Thank you for joining me. We are going to continue our read through of the Warcraft movie novel. On the last chapter, the Alliance, Lothar in particular, with a young Khadgar, went to Karazhan to try and rustle up Medivh to see if he would help them fight this new force that's menacing the lands around Stormwind. You can also check out our classic long play. We just wrapped up pretty much a lot of the kind of one-off and preliminary quests of the Burning Steppes. We'll do one more, a couple Horde-specific quests, and then we will focus on winding up for Blackrock Depths and Blackrock Spire over the next few episodes. So, without further ado, stay a while and listen for Chapter 6 of Warcraft, the movie, the novel. Khadgar was knocked off his feet, seized by an invisible grasp, and tossed into the air. He cried out, squirming, and then was slammed against one of the bookcases with such force that the massive thing slid back several feet. Taking measurements, perhaps, Medivh accused. He strode toward Khadgar, his eyes flashing with fury, his hands curled into fists. Get some ideas what you might do with the place once it's yours. Lothar must have told him. And of course he'd think that, yet Khadgar thought. He was terribly intelligent, he knew, but sometimes Khadgar also knew he could be terribly stupid. Guardian, he yelped, I renounce my vow! So I've been told. And apparently Medivh simply didn't care. Casually, the Guardian moved his arm, and Khadgar now found himself with his back against the great central staircase. Pinned like an insect to a board, the young mage dangled several feet off the ground, his arms and legs flailing. Khadgar struggled against the unseen force, but it was merciless and held him fast. Medivh snorted in contempt, watching him. Feeble, he said, his voice dripping scorn. He lifted a hand almost casually, and the pressure against Khadgar's chest increased. His fear escalated as he realized he could hardly breathe, and yet he had to speak. I didn't want to come here. I swear, Guardian, I urged them to find you. He looked desperately to Lothar. The big man simply stood there, arms folded, watching. Why didn't he say anything? I told them you should be the one to explain. Explain what? Khadgar felt his heart slamming in against his chest. His sight was beginning to dim. He struggled for another mere sip of air and managed a single word. Fell! The pressure vanished. Khadgar dropped hard to the stone floor and gasped as his air flooded his lungs. In Azeroth? Medivh demanded, striding over to him. Khadgar moved carefully, wincing. Nothing was broken, though he'd have some glorious bruises. He looked up at the Guardian, glowering down at him. In the barracks, Khadgar panted, still catching his breath. One of the bodies. Guardian, Lothar interjected. What is the Fell? Medivh did not take his eyes from Khadgar. Magic unlike any other, he said softly. It feeds on life itself. It pollutes the user, twisting everything it touches. Promises great power, but it exacts a terrible price. There is no place for the Fell in Azeroth. He fell silent, and Khadgar had a very long moment in which to wonder if mentioning the Fell had been the right tactic, and another in which to wonder if he'd be flung from the tower or simply turned into a small creature and fed to a cat. Then Medivh nodded once. You've done the right thing. To Lothar, he said, I will go. With a flurry of the folds of his crimson robe, he moved past Khadgar, not sparing the younger man a second glance. Lothar stepped forward and extended a hand to Khadgar, but as the mage reached up to take it, Lothar withdrew it and followed the Guardian. Khadgar thought about all the spells he would like to summon at this moment and the things they would do to Lothar, and wincing got to his feet by himself. Lothar carefully knotted the griffin's reins so they wouldn't come loose and adjusted them so they fit closely but comfortably around her feathered neck. He stroked her head and she cawed softly with pleasure. She'd been a reliable companion and had helped him give Khadgar a good and proper scare, and he'd miss her. He removed his hand and she opened her golden eyes in query. Back home, you. Lothar gently knocked her beak twice. The griffin shook herself, fluffing her fur and feathers, gathered her body like a cat, and leaped skyward, her wings catching the wind and propelling her back toward her Stormwind eyrie and a well-earned meal and nap. He watched her for a moment, envying the simplicity of her life when his was being upended, then turned and went toward the three mages. Medivh, clad now in a hooded cloak trimmed with raven feathers and etched symbols at each of the 4 compass points, was drawing a circle in the earth with the end of his staff. The pale blue light of arcane magic trailed after it, sparking the runes to glowing light as well. Khadgar eyed the guardian uncertainly as he worked, while Moros stood back a slight distance with his hands clasped behind his back. Medivh looked up from his task and grinned at the boy's expression. They don't teach this in Dalaran. Teleportation? Khadgar shook his head. No. His gaze drifted back to the symbols. They're right to fear it, Medivh continued. He stole another glance at Khadgar and his eyes twinkled. He's enjoying this, Lothar thought. It's very dangerous. He drew up the magic with delicate fingers, held his hand over his head, then brought his arm down with a swift, precise movement. The luminous strands he had gathered leaped up and joined, forming a dome of crackling illumination. From beneath it, his features thrown into sharp relief by the blue glow, Medivh gestured to the boy. Go on, step in. Khadgar hesitated. Come now, Medivh scoffed cheerfully. Where's all that rebel spirit? The boy's cheeks turned pink through the wisps of facial hair, and he obeyed, though not without obvious trepidation. Lothar smothered a smile himself as he stepped into the circle behind Khadgar. Mage though he was, nay, future guardian, trained to be at least, it was almost too easy to rattle him. As soon as both Lothar's feet landed inside the circle, everything, stables, the tower, even the earth beneath them, disappeared. Khadgar barely had time to gasp before other images took their place. Polished white stone instead of brown earth, the blue and gold of banners, the gleam of metallic armor. By the light, halt! The voice floated to them, faint at first, but growing louder. The extremely sharp points of pike staffs came into view, along with gauntlets, and then finally the angry and then confused faces of the king's guard. Commander? The guard gaped first at Lothar in confused recognition. Then his gaze went to Medivh. Guardian? Stand down, Lothar ordered, but not unkindly. Immediately, the guard stepped back, snapping to attention, the butts of their staffs firmly on the floor. Lane had risen from his throne and now descended, his eyes warm and a broad smile parting his neatly trimmed brown beard. Medivh bowed deeply. Your Grace, the guardian said. But Lane would have none of that. He reached out his arms to envelop Medivh in a bear hug. The guardian handed his staff to a startled Khadgar, who stared at it almost reverently in order to return the embrace, clapping his old friend on the back. When they parted, both were smiling. Medivh, it's been too long, Lane exclaimed. Come, help us get to the root of these troubles of ours. The king and the guardian strode out of the throne room, heads already bent toward one another and talking quickly and urgently. Khadgar stepped forward to follow. Lothar clamped a hand on the boy's narrow shoulder. Seen and not heard, Lothar warned. Understand? Khadgar nodded. He and Lothar followed the king into another room. Lothar knew it well. The throne room was for formal occasions and petitions for when Lane needed to be king. The war room was when the king needed to be a commander. Compared to the size and the formality of the throne room, this chamber was almost intimate. Lothar had always thought that fitting. A soldier could distance himself from the strategies, the master plans, the vast numbers of legions, and the complexities of distributing both men and material. He, or she, for women fought in Stormwind's armies, could not, however, put distance from the fact that death would be dealt. Just as the act of creating life was intimate, so was the act that took it. The ceiling was low, and the light came from a few windows and candelabras. The front part of the room was dominated by an enormous table upon which were spread maps drawn on parchment, and a second one peopled with small carved figures representing weapons, or friends or foes. Further in, the tools of war were on display: shields, swords, long and short, morning stars, pikes, axes. Khadgar, eyes wide, went straight for them, walking around the displays gingerly. These, Lane said, pointing at several clusters of red figurines, are the beasts who have been attacking us so severely. What kind of beasts? Medivh demanded, glaring at the maps. Lane looked exasperated. Giants. Armed giants. Wolves carry them. Huge unstoppable beasts. It's the rumors that are unstoppable, Lothar interrupted. There's not much we can do about that, Lane said. Medivh continued to examine the board, frowning. One hand reached out to touch the carved symbol of the mysterious foe. What of the other kingdoms? Are they suffering the same? All seek our protection, yet none trusts us enough to tell us anything. Lane had folded his arms and was glaring at the board as if his will alone could change something. In other words, little has changed in the last 6 years, Medivh said dryly. Lothar had had enough. We know nothing about these so-called monsters. He grabbed one of the enemy markers, shaking it for emphasis. We need prisoners. Even a corpse will tell us something. Lane took the small figurine from Lothar, turning it over in his hands. He lifted his eyes to the Guardian. I don't know what danger we're in, Medivh. I exist to protect this realm, my lord. It is my very purpose. I am the Guardian. Medivh's blue-green eyes went to Khadgar, who was holding the raven-topped staff and peering at the weaponry. At least, he amended, for the time being, anyhow. Lane's gaze followed Medivh and his eyebrows lifted. He'd forgotten, Lothar realized. Yes, Lane said, straightening slightly. He placed the figurine back on the map in its former position. What are we going to do about... What was his name? Khadgar, sire, the young mage replied calmly, almost elegantly, but the effect was ruined when the staff struck a sword with a loud clang as he turned. Khadgar blushed. He will be coming with us, Medivh spoke before Lothar could. Lothar rolled his eyes. Well then, we'd better get going. Lothar requested 3 horses, a company of armored soldiers, and a sturdy cart for the transportation of the hoped-for prisoners. As soon as word came that the company was ready, he, Medivh, and Khadgar strode through the main hallway of Stormwind Keep. Lothar grimaced as Sergeant Callan saluted him smartly. We are ready to depart when you give the order, sir. Let's give our guests a chance to get on their horses first, shall we, Sergeant? Callan's cheeks turned pink, but he nodded. As you say, sir, he replied. Lothar felt bad almost immediately. The boy had done everything right. By the book, even, right down to bringing Lothar's own stallion, Reliant, and 2 horses with good temperaments for Khadgar and Medivh. He hadn't earned Lothar's snide comment. The commander swung himself up into Reliant's saddle and patted the horse's sleek brown neck. Griffins were fine, but horses were better. Gruffly, he said, choose good choices for the others. Thank you, sir. Callan's expression didn't change, but Lothar saw his son's shoulders relax ever so slightly. They rode at a slow trot through the streets of the city. When they reached the market square, they passed a towering statue with a very familiar face. Khadgar did a priceless double-take, peering at the statue, then at Medivh, then at the statue again, and finally judiciously keeping his eyes straight forward. Medivh's saddle creaked as he shifted. I didn't ask them to put that up. It was true, Lothar knew. It had been erected by demand of a populace that was grateful to have not become a troll supper. You saved the city, Khadgar replied politely. The Guardian frowned slightly. You think it's vain? The people love you, Khadgar stated. Lothar fought back a smile. But that's not what I asked you. Khadgar squinted up at the blue sky. When the sun is hot, it makes excellent shade. Medivh shot his old friend an impressed glance and, seemingly despite himself, couldn't hide a smile. Once they had clattered over the bridge and through Stormwind's gates, Lothar gave the signal that the group should break into an easy canter as they headed down the road. A crowd had gathered to cheer the soldiers as they passed the Lion's Pride Inn. Lothar took care to make eye contact and return some of the children's salutes. Part of this battle, he knew already, would be won by keeping rumors to a minimum and the populace feeling safe, and a full company of 50 mounted knights in full plate armor thundering past certainly helped achieve that goal. The company was too well trained to make idle conversation, so the way was silent, save for the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves and the fluttering and scolding of birds and squirrels. Lothar thought about what he'd seen, the vile mist surging forth from a dead man's mouth. He'd been quick to calm Lane, but in truth he had no better idea of what these beasts were than a farmer gulping ale in the Lion's Pride Inn. And Callan. He really didn't like the idea of the young man being involved, not until they knew what they were facing. Damn Taria, anyway. She meant well, but she didn't. He frowned. The forest was silent. Medivh, who rode a little ways ahead of him, had brought his horse down to a trot, then a halt. Lothar lifted his fist, and the rest of the company clattered to a stop behind him. He kneed Reliant forward to the edge of the clearing beside Medivh. What had once been an ordinary broad path through a pleasant part of Elwyn had become a battlefield. Not a proper one consisting of soldiers and armies, but the worst kind. The kind where the weapons were scythes, pitchforks, and small axes, and the soldiers were farmers and townspeople. Carts lay everywhere, smashed and overturned. Some cargo, like linen and wool, had been rummaged through and discarded. Other carts, presumably carrying food, had been picked clean. Several of the trees had their limbs hacked off or smashed by weapons so large Lothar was having a hard time grasping the size of them. And there was blood. Both the red of human blood and also splashes here and there of a thick brown fluid. Lothar dismounted, removing his glove and touching the liquid, rubbing it between his fingers. Something very important was missing. Bodies. Medivh and Khadgar too had dismounted. Medivh strode ahead, absently planting his staff in the ground. Khadgar caught it before it tumbled to the earth. The Guardian was staring at a burned tree trunk that gave off a sickly green smoke. Glowing embers in the blackened wood winked like emeralds. It can't be. It can't be, Lothar thought he heard Medivh murmur. He saw Khadgar's attention shift to something behind one of the carts. He has a body, the boy said, then called out, Guardian! There was a blur of motion. Lothar's head whipped around just in time to see one of his knights go flying, his mail and chest crushed in by a thrown hammer a third as large as he was. The hitherto silent forest was now filled with a terrible roaring sound, and the beasts they had been hunting poured into the clearing, exploding out of nowhere, dropping from the trees. Giants. Armed giants. Wolves to carry them. Huge, unstoppable beasts. Lothar's first absurd thought was that the rumors hadn't gone far enough. All right, they're going to have our first contact where with real warriors of the Alliance versus their Horde counterparts. Maybe we'll get a battle scene in the next chapter. All right, everybody, thank you so much, as always, for watching, listening, and tuning in. I appreciate it always. You all rock. This episode of The Pipe 5x5.